Welcome, everyone, to this next session as part of ADR Cyberweek 2024. I've been looking forward to this session all week, and I'm delighted to have some dispute resolution luminaries here with us, the father of online dispute resolution, Ethan Catch, in the house, and Dan Rainey, the incoming president of ICODER, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution. And Michael, thank you for all of the great work you did with the Chinese sessions this week at ADR Cyberweek. This will be a very memorable year because of all of those fantastic sessions. But this is going to be the best session of Cyberweek. I know it. I'm very confident. No pressure, Jen. But let me just say a few words about why I'm so excited for this session. So many of you remember that the Pew Charitable Trust, a large private foundation in the United States, made an announcement. They launched a program a few years ago to promote access to justice through the use of technology. And Pew did a lot of studies. They interviewed a lot of us in the ODR field, and they ended up promoting online dispute resolution in line with another initiative that they called litigant portals to find a way to expand access to justice, and particularly for self-represented litigants. Well, one of the things that Pew funded as part of that project, I think they put $250 million into that project, was 3 research teams across the United States that were selected through a competitive process to do longitudinal, high-quality research on ODR programs. And so there were 3 teams that were selected. One was at the University of Arizona, I think. One was at Harvard. And the third team was a partnership between RSI, the estimable nonprofit focused on quality dispute resolution in the court system, and UC Davis. And I'm delighted today to have Jen here, who was the leading researcher or a partner with Donna on the several projects that were funded by that Pew grant. And I think this is a huge opportunity for those of us in the ODR field to go through a lot of Jen's great work and take away some of the observations and also pick Jen's brain. And my co-host for this conversation is my buddy and friend, brother from another mother, hermano from another, I don't know how to say it in Spanish, Nico from Redek. So if you haven't seen the Redek platform, I urge you to check it out, redek.co. It's amazing. And Nico has been a pioneer in ODR ever since we first met as part of UNCITRAL Working Group 2, probably a decade ago. So I'm delighted to have you engaged in this conversation as well, Nico. So Jen, we're going to be firing lots of questions at you. And one of the things, and Noam is joining as well, another ODR luminary who I know was also involved in your advisory board. So Jen, let me just ask a couple framing questions first. And I actually do have the report up, and I'll put a link in the chat so that everybody can look at it as well. But first of all, tell me a little bit about RSI and your role at RSI before we get started.
Sure. RSI stands for Resolution Systems Institute, and we are the only organization, we're a nonprofit, the only organization in the United States that solely focuses on ADR in the courts. We do go a little bit outside of the courts now, but our focus is on court ADR. I am the director of research, and in that role, I conduct program evaluations. I've done evaluations of all sorts of programs, including child protection, family, small claims, eviction, foreclosure, etc. But we also do normal research. So we're doing research into what mediators do, what communication behaviors they use might result in greater trust in both the mediator and trust between the parties. And we are also doing some research on, and this is very directly related to our topic today as well, on how courts can better communicate with self-represented litigants, and particularly those with low literacy, to help them understand and knowledgeably use and feel comfortable and knowledgeably use online dispute resolution. And I can start going into that because of the evaluation, but I'll stop.
Sure. Well, I put a link to the report we're going to be talking about today, and I also put a link to the RSI website. So many of us in the ODR field know Susan Yates well, and Susan's been very involved with NCTDR and some of these ODR meetings in the past. RSI did a great project evaluating family ODR, and they had several conversations that I think many of us participated in. So RSI has unimpeachable credibility in this area, and a lot of that's due to your great work, Jen, because I think RSI really grounds a lot of its work in this kind of high quality longitudinal research. The practitioners like me and like many of the people on the call, we're just out there trying to make it go, like, okay, well, what do we build? What do you want? You talk to the customers, interviews the users, talk to the litigants, and try and figure it out. Oftentimes I'll have a questionnaire at the end of my process. Say, how did you think that went? Did you feel like it was procedurally just? Would you recommend it to a friend or family member? But one of the things that we can't do is that kind of longitudinal research. So I have courts ask me all the time, well, how do we know? Like, you may deliver outcomes more efficiently through your tools, but how do I know that people aren't going to be back here in 2 years, saying, hey, the agreement fell apart? And I say to them, I don't have that data. Like, I'm not gathering that longitudinal data. I can only really get customer satisfaction data in the moment. So that's why your work is so important. And that's why I think it's so great. We're going to take the time and go through and look at some of the observations that you made. The second question I have for you is, what was your methodology for this research? What was the design approach that you came up with for analyzing this particular family process in Ottawa County?
Sure. So we started out with a survey, looked at court data, ODR data, and survey before and after the process is used. And we had a control group of people who were referred to ODR, but didn't use it, against people who were referred and did use it. So there's a little bit of a selection bias in there, but we had an apples to apples in that, cases that were not appropriate for ODR were not included in the control group. Our initial survey was meant to get some information about their thoughts about using ODR, what they understood about ODR before they started, and a lot of other sort of background information about the parties. And then post mediation, why do I keep saying mediation? Post ODR, we looked at how they felt, again, during ODR, whether their anxiety level decreased or not, or if they felt excited about using it, those sorts of things, along with some procedural justice stuff, along with their preferences. Did they enjoy ODR? Would they have preferred a different process? And then we also looked at court data. So was this case then sent on for a hearing? How long did it take for a case to get from filing to closure? And ODR data, such as when did they use it? How did they use it? And I believe that's it.
That's great. No, that's great. So that's another thing that we as ODR service providers, we don't get access to people that didn't use the platform. So that's really important, right? Because if we don't have a baseline to evaluate, if people say, well, hey, how satisfied were you with this process? Well, we don't know how satisfied the people were that didn't use the process. So maybe those people who are using face-to-face processes were equivalently satisfied, but if we don't know that, we don't know. So okay, that's great. One of the first questions. So this was Ottawa County, Michigan, and it was a family ODR process that was powered by Matterhorn, right?
Correct.
So can you say a little bit about, so it's interesting, a lot of times, and I see Paul has joined us too, who's been on the front lines of this as well, and was at NCSC when, I think ODR was first introduced to a lot of these courts. So I'm interested to have everybody weigh in on this as well. But what was your sense of the attitude about ODR from the court staff perspective when you began this project?
So this program is a little bit different in that it wasn't the court directly that was running it. It was an organization that was under the aegis of the court, but was semi-independent. So it's called the Friend of the Court.
Okay.
And they were tasked with dealing with any issues that arose from Title IV child support payments initially. Okay. And that sort of expanded as they understood that child support was really linked to things like parenting time, custody. And so they started out by using it for child support enforcement cases and found that it worked really well for that. And then expanded it to all the other two, both non-compliance and anytime that parents wanted to just change something because their circumstances changed for parenting time, custody, and child support.
So like modification of divorce orders. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, post-separation. Okay, got it.
Post-separation. So this is all post-decree. And among the caseworkers, so the parents are assigned a caseworker that follows them for the entirety of their children's, until their children turn 18, essentially. Among the caseworkers, there was a definite difference of opinion as to whether they wanted to use ODR, and that really showed up in the data. There were some that use it all the time, and there were some that just did not want to use it. They had their process. They wanted to keep using that process. The court itself was really interested in doing it because they wanted to reduce the number of hearings that the parents went to. So they were all on board. But they didn't have as much to do with it as the Friends of the Court.
As the Friends of the Court. Okay, very interesting. That's definitely something that I've seen with the mediators, court-connected mediators that we've worked with. Some of them are like, yeah, this is great, let's try it, and they're eager to engage in the design, they're eager to engage the tools, figure out what works and what doesn't, they're willing to experiment. Others, I mean, we've had some court-connected mediation programs, the court's excited about it, but the court-connected mediation program is like, nope, we don't do this. This is not the way we operate. We've been doing this for decades. We're not interested in technology. This, again, I was having these conversations largely pre-pandemic. So maybe some of those attitudes have changed because we do know the majority of mediations are happening over Zoom now. And Zoom is different, obviously, than the use of tools like Matterhorn. But that's interesting that there was that split, that there were people who were enthusiastic about it. And I don't know if that enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm was associated with the tool itself, or maybe the preconceptions of the folks at Friends of the Court, whether or not they like technology or didn't like technology. It's like, I've been doing this and I didn't use technology, it worked fine. I don't need technology here. Don't, because I definitely have seen a lot of resistance on the part of incumbent providers when they say, well, it's not broken. Why would I fix it?
Right. Yeah, we did interview a number of caseworkers, and the sense that we got was that the caseworkers who liked it, one, they were involved in the creation of it. So they understood the technology a lot better than other caseworkers. And then two, there was a sense that I don't want to use technology. I don't understand technology. I understand my system. So that was the resistance. There was a little bit of resistance after use, but primarily it was resistance to use.
Okay, got it. Well, I'd like to actually share my screen and show some of the components of your report.
Sure.
Nico, do you have any questions before I do that?
No, please, Colin, proceed, and I'll have a follow-up question.
Okay, great. And please, everybody, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, because I think we're going to go, once we get through some of the substantive stuff that Jen has in the report, then I think we can chew over this together. But one of the questions that I had, looking at the process flow here, and this is the FOC ODR program process, was the IPV screening. And this was something when we were building family ODR platforms, there was a lot of suspicion about our ability to effectively do that IPV screen. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because I see in the flow here, it says IPV not present and IPV present. And I know when we built the Rectvisor, it was just a couple questions. Has there ever been a protection order? Has there ever been, any formal proceedings around the safety of the couple or the children in this relationship? And if the answer was no, they just proceeded. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Sure. So Michigan, actually, the entire state has a screening tool that they use throughout for all family cases. And so they just basically brought that tool into the ODR process.
Okay.
So it's multiple questions. I can't say whether it works or not, but it's more than just those two questions.
That's not your job in this, was not to evaluate there. I will say, and I'm going to put this in the chat, we built a system with a with a researcher named Amy Applegate at
Yes.
Indiana, who's an expert on this IPv screening. And she created something called the MASIC, which is a mediator assessment for IPv. And it's a very in-depth tool. Now, we never integrated that into any of our family ODR processes, but if you want to check it out, it's freely available at that link. You can go click through it and see. But this is something that I know was a reason why courts, when we were first bringing ODR into the courts, the family courts, a lot of them said, I don't want to do it because I'm worried about IPv. You know, like I just don't trust that you can do that screening effectively through an online process. So that was just why I asked that question.
Yes, and from what I understand, the MASIC, in short, it is a mediator-driven process, so it is verbal,
right?
But there's no reason why you can't have that within an ODR platform either.
Well, it's interesting because it is intended for the mediator to ask those questions. It's not a self-paced.
Right.
You know, so I don't know, maybe with AI, you could have an AI read it or something like that. But it is interesting if you go through, and it's freely available, so you can fill it out and it's not a problem because none of that data is captured. You're not messing up any research project, but you can see the recommendations at the end. And there's a score that's generated and it tells you based on that score what the appropriate path forward for the mediator might be. Nico, I see you put your hand up.
Yes, and following up on what was just said, so there's a process also going on in Colombia, and I know Colin knows about this because we had discussions with the Ministry of Justice about the possibility of implementing ODR for the Colombian family commissaries, or the family sheriff, if you may call it so. And one of the discussions we were having is the fear of people of trying to attend any procedure at all. And this lack of credibility and yes, the lack of legitimacy of intending to go to any kind of system, more so if it's technological, because if you don't have the technological capabilities, then you feel in a way threatened or discouraged to do so. So I wanted to know, again, what your opinion is about this, because that was part of the discussions we were having in Colombia. And I think that perfectly applies to ODR, to family ODR, because in a way, there's a lot of psychology behind this, right? There's a lot of emotions that you have to deal with in the design of one of these platforms.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if I understand the question. Is the question like, can you even use ODR if there is IPv present?
I think it's a legitimacy. Question.
Legitimacy of doing that. This is an argument that goes back to the beginning of mediation, right? So back, I remember 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, where people were saying you cannot use mediation for cases involving IPv. And that was completely wrong. We know now that people who are victims of IPv want to mediate because they feel empowered by the process. And so it really is, there is a need to be able to determine, give that power back to that person in terms of deciding what process they want to use. And we also know that people who are in this situation feel empowered, but they can't, they aren't in the same room, they feel more secure, all of that. Right. So I suspect that with research, we will find that with proper screening, that ODR would be completely fine.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Guardrails and screening.
Yeah, when Nico had me down to Bogota, I was interested to learn that in Colombia, only about 50% of the population has access to the internet or accesses the internet on a regular basis. So I feel like Colombia is sort of where the United States was, gosh, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So there's a real question around the legitimacy of online processes because it's not mainstreamed yet. Whereas I think in the United States, it feels like, especially post-pandemic, these online processes have been totally legitimized. And this notion that somehow, well, you're going to go through an online process. Well, is that a real thing? Why would I trust this? It's just a website that I'm going through. I feel like there's been a cultural change in the United States.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
I misunderstood the
No,
question.
no, your response
you're right.
is 100% correct.
Yes.
So
okay.
please, Nico.
Yeah. I can also talk about legitimacy in terms of the process. Because we have done focus groups with people about ODR. basically finding out how we can, as I mentioned in the beginning, how courts can communicate better with them. But we also asked them about, we got a lot of information about their feelings about the process itself and about legitimacy. And we found that there is a real desire for the process, but there is also a fear of the process not being legitimate. And that comes down to a lot of like, is this really the court? That they're so afraid of scams. But once you can assure them of that, boy, do they want ODR. I mean, we user tested a whole bunch of stuff. And by the time they understood that it was confidential, it was part of the court, that it was secure, that they could have a mediator if they wanted to, that they could get help from the court, they were so excited about it. They were like, when can I use this?
Well, that's huge. And I want to spend more time talking about that in particular, because I know you've come up with messaging, improved messaging from the court about these projects, because I think one of your findings, and I don't want to jump ahead too much because I want to get to the executive summary, but people would get these emails from the platform and they're like, is this really the court? Is this a real thing? Does this have the same? So I think it gets this broader concept of legitimacy too. We need to be able to communicate with the parties in such a way that they know that they're in the right place. This is the court. The outcome of this process matters. It's not just another email that's coming in like with all their spam and they can just click delete and move on. I think that's one of the big challenges. But let me just ask a smaller question before we get to that, because I want to revisit that point with you and learn more about what you learned. It looks like this is an opt-in process. So the users—
It is not.
It is not. It's mandatory. Okay, so I'm looking at this process flow here. So both parties are sent an invitation to register, and then both parties register. But if one or both parties don't register, then it seems like it gets pulled out of the flow. So it's mandatory that they do it, but they have to register. This is the thing about mediation. It's a mandatory voluntary process.
It's a mandatory, and they can opt out through. So it's more of a soft opt or a passive opt out. Maybe.
Okay. So they're required to participate, but if they don't pursue, if they don't respond, then eventually they will be bounced out of the process. But
and that's pretty much any ODR program that I saw.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about that because I think that's one of the things that's tough about a lot of these ODR processes. I've seen well-designed ODR processes that just aren't marketed well. And then there's no awareness on the part of the litigants that it exists. So you only have 10 cases. I mean, you have courts that are spending an enormous amount of time building these systems. But I think there's an assumption made about the court's ability to communicate to these litigants to say, hey, this is an option available to you, and this is why you should select it. But that's not what the courts are optimized to do. It usually is party initiated. So let's not spend too much time on the flow here. Let's look at your findings and recommendations. So I thought this is very interesting when the uncertainty about ODR use was highly dependent upon one party's impression of the other party's desires. Can you say a little bit about that?
Right. So if a party said they weren't sure if they wanted to use ODR prior to ODR, it was because they didn't know if the other party wanted to use it. And so there was no communication about that from the caseworker.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. And you said participants had mixed feelings about ODR, with just significant majorities reporting feeling excitement and also anxiety, and nearly half expressing confusion. So tell me more about that. Like, what was the source of their confusion? Just not understanding it, not knowing what ODR stood for, not legitimacy. What was that like?
Unfortunately, in this evaluation, we did not ask for any follow-up. We asked them simply what their feelings were about using ODR prior to using it and then after using it. So we don't know what that is.
Okay. But
I do know
those are high percentages,
Yeah. I do know from our focus groups that a lot of that comes from legitimacy, and a lot of that comes from not understanding what the process is in the first place because they haven't learned. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I think I've spent a lot of time in the courts. I'm still confused by it. So, for 48.6% to say they felt confused, I'm like, I sympathize with that. But this recommendation is very important. And I think this is a key dialogue that's happening right now, is the requirement to use ODR, making it opt-in or making it mandatory. And your recommendation is to clearly communicate the requirement to use ODR. So can you speak a little bit about that recommendation?
Right. What we found was that a lot of the parties didn't know that it was required. They didn't understand, obviously, that the other party was required to use it as well. And so caseworkers, when we talked with them, we asked them what they said, and it was not necessarily specific enough to educate the parties about the requirement. We also found this in Texas when we did an ODR evaluation there, that
Right.
a lot of people did not even know they were required.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's one of those things where we just really have to pay much more attention to communication and how we communicate the requirement, and how we communicate about ODR in general.
Yeah, I think our mutual friend, Nancy Welsh, I think she's talked to me about how the success of a court-connected mediation program often has to do with how clearly the judge tells the parties, you need to do this. You know, like if the party, do you want to do this? No, I don't want to. Let's go to a hearing. But if the judge says, look, you need to do this. I know this is good for you. Go do this. You're not going to get in front of me until you go do this. Like, so I think that's kind of like this referral point, you know, clearly
and even
communicate.
in voluntary programs, if the judge highly suggests it, says this is really good for you, I really recommend it, then there's a higher level of participation.
Uptake. Yeah. Okay. It was very interesting when you were learning, and I think it's very important for us to have, because I think many ODR providers, we don't get this level of insight about our users, you know, knowing that they don't trust the other side. They don't trust them to be truthful. They are, you know, they think they might lie. You know, I think sometimes, and maybe I'm speaking for myself here, I presume sort of people come into the process like a blank slate, like, look, I have a problem, I need it solved. But I think these numbers are interesting because it's not a blank slate. They come in with high mistrust of the other side. The only reason why they're in the court, they've already tried to negotiate with them and were rebuffed, and they were so motivated by that they actually pursued a legal filing. So I think this was also very interesting. Nico, I see your hands up. What did you want to say?
Thank you, Godfather. But what I wanted to mention, Jen, is the following: is I agree with what Colin just said, and I would like to add, apart from in terms of emotion, and when the report was mentioning the distrust people felt for each other in the context of ODR, also, how about cultural differences? Because I guess the way a Colombian, or I don't know, an African person would approach the very same conflict, even having the very same platform, would be different. So I don't know if you could mark for any cultural difference, even within the US or even within the community in Michigan. So you can say, you know, people from, I don't know, African American roots have a different approach from mostly white people, because I think that does make a difference. And I think you could differentiate in terms of, you know, looking into the big picture of what's going on in terms of emotions and culture.
Did you capture any data like that, Jen, in your study?
We captured data, but we didn't have enough data to actually do any analyses on that. But I think that's a really good point, and I think something research on that would be really interesting. I mean, just the different approaches to dealing with conflict. If you're two different cultures trying to communicate, that could be something.
I'd say a lot of the mediations I've done in court context really are cultural conflicts. I mean, there's just different assumptions that come from a high context culture versus a low context culture about appropriate behavior in a negotiation. The parties don't see it that way. They see it as over the substance of the disagreement. But I think it's a very interesting point, Nico. And I will say also, in working with courts will often ask me to put in questions about demographics and, you know, ethnicity and income levels. And that feels a little creepy to me, you know, like just as an ODR provider, like at eBay, we never asked any of those questions. Like it was all anonymous. You never saw the photo of the other side. It was just some sort of amorphous entity that had interests that were in conflict with yours. Whereas the courts obviously want that data because they want to make sure that they can meet all of the needs of the different groups that they're tasked with servicing. But I don't know. It's hard when someone says, okay, I have a dispute because you broke my lawnmower. Okay, what race are you? Like, why is that relevant in this? So, but Nico, what were you going to say?
No, but I would say it's extremely relevant. And sometimes, you know, all it's about is, maybe because I belong to this. In Colombia, it's more about classes than races.
Right. Sure.
It is in the US. But I've also worked in mediation for many years at several chambers of commerce in Colombia. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that it actually depends on the neighborhood you live in. And then you can have a very different scope or different view on a particular conflict if you are in the north of Bogota or if you're in the south of Bogota. And it does make a difference, after all, if you want to do informed mediation, which is, if you're a good mediator, you have to be properly informed. And if you want to do informed mediation, those are extremely, extremely relevant questions.
Yeah. Well, I know you're doing all this work with alternative credit mechanisms for low-income people in Colombia. So you know a lot about that, more than I do. I will say my court-connected mediations I did in South Boston, which is kind of a poor area of Boston. And I co-mediated with this guy, Tom, who's from that neighborhood. And parties would come in and he would say, what street do you live on? What neighborhood do you live on? In Dorchester. Oh, I live on Elm Street. Elm Street. Melissa, it's like this kind of connection. And then he would use that in the dispute to get a resolution. And I didn't have that. I was just some nerdy kid from Texas. Like I didn't have that cultural cachet. But I do think when we design these ODR systems, sometimes there's a temptation as a developer to say that's irrelevant. That's stuff, that community stuff, that cultural stuff. If we build an optimal algorithm, we don't need to worry about that. And I think that that's short-sighted because I think I have seen how effective it can be in a face-to-face context to use those elements of connection to urge the parties towards agreement. So, all right, I think it's an excellent point. But let me go through because there's a lot. Jen, did you have something you wanted to say on that before we?
Yeah, not on Tom and mediators understanding culture, but on the idea that parties didn't trust each other. One of the big concerns that we found both with our focus group and then later with user testers for our models that we created coming out of the focus groups was that they were really concerned about the other party being untruthful and being nasty. And for that reason, they really wanted a mediator. They wanted either somebody monitoring the communications or they wanted a mediator.
Sure.
To help them facilitate the communications. Because
to say, see how unreasonable they are? Look, right? Yeah. What we found at eBay is if people emailed each other, they said horrible things to each other, just horrible. But if we put them in a platform where eBay had visibility into their communications, they behaved themselves because they thought that somebody might see that. Exactly. So like having a monitor, having a third party there really does transform the behavior of the parties because they know even if eBay never looked at it, the chance that eBay could look at it changed their behavior, because we didn't look and we had millions and millions of these cases. We only looked at like 0.01%. Okay, so I thought this recommendation was also very interesting. Make it more challenging for parties to opt out of ODR. Yes. And we just did this Future DR conference at Stanford a couple months ago. And Leonardo D'Urso, who's the founder of ADR Center in Rome, they have mandatory mediation in Italy. And he was a big architect of that. And he said the only way that you're going to have successful dispute resolution is if it's mandatory and it's hard to get out of it. And that means the judges have to hold people's feet to the fire and say, did you give this a real try? Did you engage with this? So if somebody needs to know there's even a penalty, if they don't register, they don't use this platform, the judge needs to scold them a little bit when they come in and say, look, I see here that you didn't try this and that's not good for you. Like that communication is important. So I think this is something that I'm starting to be convinced of. I'm a big advocate of human-centered design. And I think a lot of ODR platforms, we want to make it really easy for the parties to do whatever they want. And if that means they want to get out of ODR, fine. One button, they're out. You go to the hearing. But I think it's interesting that this may be where this may not be what a user tells you. I want you to make it harder for me to get out of ODR, but this may be something that's important for the success of the program. So I wonder if you can say one
and the other part is make it easy to get in.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's a carrot and stick, right? So you want to give them, hey, look how great this platform is going to be for you. You don't want to go this way. You don't want to, because that's not going to be the best path for you. But do you have any more aspects of this recommendation to elucidate? I see Nico's got his hand up too. But
I know, but I wanted to follow up on a different topic. So I don't know if you want to conclude.
Yeah, well, just Jen, why don't you just finish that? Do you have anything more to say? I'm going to say now we're talking about ODR 2.0 in the courts. I'm going to be very pushy with these courts to say this needs to be mandatory. This needs to be at least opt out.
Yeah,
You know?
here's what I think is, as long as we don't have good communication,
Right.
where people don't know that they're supposed to use it in the first place, or they don't understand it and all of that. And as long as we don't have that, I don't like the idea of saying, big old stick, maybe
Yeah.
a little stick, but
A little poke.
a little poke,
Yeah.
right? But once you have all of that in place, and it's really easy, all the barriers are taken out of the way. I completely agree that you have to make it mandatory. I mean, we have an eviction mediation program with RSI where, if the tenant goes and go to mediation, they get defaulted for, and sent to eviction just for not attending the mediation. I mean, that's a huge stick.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Nico, what question did you want to ask before I get to the attorney part?
Ever since I read this, and I wanted to ask about this, attorneys could not participate in ODR, and I understand where you're going, and I think that's actually also said for mediation in general that attorneys should not participate. But I wonder if this is because of how lawyers are culturally, and as a guild, so to speak, or if this is because of how parties react to it. Because I've noticed that even for ODR, and we're doing a pilot, and Colin knows everything about me, but there's a pilot we're doing with Telefonica, with a telecommunications company here in Colombia. And one of the discussions we were having is whether we should get lawyers involved. And we ended up figuring out that lawyers were adding a lot of value to our pilot because they were guiding also legally the process. Of course, they have to be identified with the ODR and they have to be identified with the solution, but they can add value. So I wonder, what your take is on this, and maybe it's because in the US it's a very litigious culture, or it's because we are so bad. I don't know.
A lot of lawyers on this call. Be careful, Nico. But I mean, I do think. Myself. Yeah, I think a lot of lawyers I present to bar associations and they resist ODR because they think it's trying to get them out of the process. And I actually agree with Jem's recommendation 100% here that, we should, there's no reason. I mean, the iCoder standards say that if somebody's a lawyer, they should be able to participate in the process. It's a handful of cases where I've seen the lawyer actually thwart the ODR process, thwart a negotiation. In many more cases, I've seen the lawyer actually help their party and talk to them and say, well, look, these are your options. This is your choice, and coach them through it. I do think that when I think about ODR, I'm really, my default persona is a self-represented litigant who is not represented and is trying to navigate this process, and it's complicated for them. But if somebody is represented, I welcome the participation of the attorney. And I think it was too bad that the Matterhorn platform didn't create an account for the attorney to come in and join, because they can have the same access rights as the party that they represent. And they can participate in, and I think they can help, steer towards a good resolution. So I agree with this recommendation too. We need to, and if the message to lawyers is we're trying to cut you out, well, then they're going to do whatever they can to shut ODR down because they don't want to be cut out.
Right. And in Michigan, there were a number of parties who said they weren't going to participate in ODR because they wanted to be able to use their lawyer throughout the process. And
yeah.
But my question, just to get clear, is because Matterhorn, or by design, you consider that lawyers would not be of added value to the solution of the conflict, or what was behind this?
It was our understanding that the technology of the platform would not easily allow more than one person on each side. And having sat in on a design meeting in Hawaii with Turbo Court,
right,
it became pretty clear that the idea was it was going to be two attorneys coming in and working things out on ODR. That was their concept. And I think that was Matterhorn's concept as well. Perhaps, I don't know, but it was always this, for every platform we looked at, there was a technological barrier to having two.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a systems design issue. Our platform does allow attorneys to participate alongside their parties, but I know Matterhorn started out with traffic disputes, and I think the number of people that have lawyers in traffic disputes has got to be less than 1%.
Yeah,
You know,
so
it's
maybe
like,
it was because they didn't expect lawyers.
exactly. So they built the platform presuming it was going to be the parties interacting, or it was going to be lawyers exclusively representing the parties. So, yeah, so I think it's another one that I think this is great. And I want to loop back on what you said before. The messaging is crucial. And we do understand, particularly in these text-based processes, the language in these emails, the language in the platform, the language on the website, both the court's website and the ODR website is crucially important because they don't have nonverbal cues. They're not interacting with someone, you know, that can answer their questions in real time. So I know you've put a lot of thought into this, and your recommendation to review and test the language, you have written improved emails too. So share with all of us in the ODR field, you know, what are your takeaways and what are the best practices around these communications?
Sure. So a big takeaway is that one, email isn't the best way to get in touch with people, because particularly people with lower incomes, lower education, they tend to use text. They will look at their mail. So these platforms have gone off and started using text messaging as well as emails, but so a lot of emails just get lost. But you have to start with very simple messaging, simple language that gives them, this is exactly what you have to do, step by step. Here's how you get help. And help is extremely important to them. That there is somebody that they can call and talk to. Some said they would talk with a chatbot. As AI gets more relevant to people's lives and more prominent, I think they would totally be willing to talk to AI much more, and you won't need a person, but they wanted to know, one, was this thing that I just got in the mail legitimate? Should I go on with it? Because we gave them basically a summons and then a notice of ODR with that summons, and they wanted to make sure that they were actually being sued. They also wanted to be assured, and this was really important to them. They wanted assurance that they were doing what they were doing was right, because they were afraid to put one foot wrong and then have their whole case like get, you know, end up having, you know, no defenses or anything being defaulted or whatever. So that was really important. Having the seal of the court was really, really important to them for legitimacy purposes, both on the ODR platform, and I do not understand why that was not possible, but it was not possible to have it on the ODR platform, and on the notice and anything else. They also really wanted to have both video and text. So anything that was in text, a lot of people wanted to see that in video because that's how they could understand the information better.
Oh,
and we
totally.
did observe people just like paging through and not reading because they just can't take in that written information.
Well, yeah, we did studies at eBay that shows when you present text content on a web page, people, and not even this is independent of reading ability, people will skip to the bottom to look at the action item. Like when you think about those driver's license tests, you know, or you're trying to get your points removed on your license, and they give you all this content, you skip to the bottom. If you can answer the question, you don't need to watch the video. So you just answer the question and move on. So people don't read text the way they read a book. And I think that that's often a fallacious assumption on the part of user experience designers. But the other thing we need to think about again is reading level. And, you know, a lot of people want verbal content because that's the way that they process it best. So I like your message about video as well. You know, it can be the same content, but just there's different ways that people absorb it. So yeah.
Exactly. And then providing them all the, so what we found is people did feel very comfortable the more they understood about the process. So we basically forced them through learning about the process before they got on, and including a guide that allows them to figure out what they want to do once they start negotiating. And that allowed some of our users to understand that there were other options other than paying them the full amount. We had them paying $7,600, and like you could do a payment plan, and that got them excited. So all of those things, making them more comfortable, getting more trust, is really important to getting people to actually use it.
Nico, what do you want to say?
It's, I don't want to take too much of the time because this is so exciting and I'm really eager to listen more. But there's one question for you, extra question for you, Jen, on that context of language. Isn't sometimes easier to have someone make a phone call because of the nonverbal cues Colin was mentioning just a minute ago? To get a phone call or a video conference, like a short video conference, because people feel easily intimidated when they get anything related to calls.
Yes, I mean that is,
So they say, oh, I'm going to go to jail. Like first thought, I'm going to go to jail. So I don't want to do anything.
Right,
So,
which is
yeah.
So yeah, we asked them about how they felt when they got that summons, you know, both in the focus group and in the user testing group. And they felt overwhelmed. They felt really stressed. They felt, you know, oh my God, I'm being sued for $7,600. Yeah, so definitely. And that's why I said you have to have help and you have to have that phone number all over the place because they need to be able to call and get assurance and be able to calm down. Because there is research that says if you're overwhelmed and if you're stressed, you do not take information in at all or as well.
Yeah,
So, Nico.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think, especially because if you're optimizing for mobile, like you say in your recommendations, it's so easy for people to push a button and get on the phone with somebody. So that's people often don't think of a phone call as ODR, but it is. That's technology assisted dispute resolution. I thought it was also interesting that 81% of parties use ODR outside of the office hours of the service provider, and that was consistent with the results we got when we were in Nevada too. Because, you know, when are people going to engage with the process? It's going to be late on a weekday or it's going to be on weekends. So if you say, well, you know, if you need any support, it's 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Well, you're going to miss 80% of the people because they're engaging with it at another time. So the AI piece is interesting, but yeah, we need to think about the role that phone-based support can play, especially in a court-based process like this. So. All right, I'm cognizant of the fact we're running out of time, which is sad because I could talk to you about this for another 3 hours, Jen. But let's talk about the evaluations of their experience with ODR. So the procedural justice ratings here, can you walk us through this?
Yeah, so what we found is when people used ODR, they were very pleased with it. They really thought that it was fair. They trusted the caseworker. And I think if you go down even further, we made comparisons to people who didn't use ODR, and they were far more likely to feel that it was very fair, far less likely to think that it was very unfair, far more likely to feel satisfied with the outcome, very satisfied with the outcome, rather than very dissatisfied. They felt more control over the outcome. So all of those things really showed that ODR has a great promise if we can, and it's just up to us to make it work.
Well, and I love all your recommendations, but this is something we in the ODR field, because this is not an ODR provider. This is hardcore research that Jen and her team did. You know, when you're talking about standard deviations, you're not talking about, you know, hey, I got 5 satisfaction surveys that said they'd recommend it to their mom, you know, so that's really, really powerful. And then impressions of the process. Most parties felt they had at least some control over the outcome. The majority of parties were not satisfied with their outcome. So can you say a little bit more about that?
We don't have any understanding really about why, but
that seems like a high number to me.
Yeah, it is. And I'm guessing that it has to do with the topic, but it did not have anything to.
Well, right. It's not a happy situation to begin with. So,
no.
You know, well, okay. There's other things in here, and I highly recommend everybody to go through the report. I think this is fantastic work, but I want to stop my share because we have so many great people on the call. I want to get, you know, comments, thoughts, and feedback from our attendees here. You know, Paul obviously has spent a lot of time evaluating these programs and setting up court ODR systems too. And Ethan, I know you were an advisor to this effort. So does anybody have any comments or questions? It said, Jim posted something that said there's an increasing recognition that courts are far more likely to have an email address than a street address. And Paul said that's what Utah discovered as well. So I think that's very interesting. I mean, for a long time, maybe I'm talking back in the early 2000s, I would go to courts and say, hey, you should build ODR. And they'd say, well, only rich people have computers. So you're just building a justice system for rich people. But I think that's turned around now. I think, 98% of US citizens access the internet on a daily basis. So there is legitimacy to this. But
Colin, if I may add, because this is more of a discussion of the digital breach, is more of a discussion in Colombia. And I always get the counter argument that, we live in Colombia. And you know how Colombia, and then you always get the argument of the deep Colombia, right? So then what if you go to the Amazon?
Right.
What if you go to the high mountain, right? And then there's no internet whatsoever. And then I say, look, you have to compare the possibility one person has to get access to a cell phone in the Amazon and the access they have to an actual court. So for a person in Colombia, and this is real life, I'm not making this up. Sometimes you have to first take a boat for 4 hours, then you have to take a
bus for
truck for 7 extra hours, and then you have to fly to get to a city, and that's where you're gonna have access to justice. So is that what you really want? No, it's open for everyone, so it's more legit. So yes, I fully
agree. That's a question as compared to what, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard access when we were doing property tax assessment appeals. We got notes all the time from people that said, look, I'm 3 hours away from the office, and this is the only option I had. And I'm old, I'm mobility challenged, and I just couldn't file it. I knew I was being treated unfairly for 7 years, but I had no option. And then you made this online option, then I did it. I got it fixed in, 2 weeks. So thank you so much for that. So again, I think, what is it that's really going to motivate people to make these changes? I often think that courts optimize for cost, right? And their own KPIs, more so than maybe, the litigant experience, or, because again, they don't have the same visibility into the efficacy of the outcome. They get evaluated on cost per case and time to resolution and things like that. But I think your point is very well taken, Nico, that compared to what question. But that's not a reason for us to lower our standards too. When people argue about access, we say, well, yeah, but the alternative is access is terrible. So, at least we're marginally better than that. But Jim, what were we going to say?
Yeah, I've actually learned a lesson over the decades, because there was a day when the cutting edge technology was CDs, or DVDs. And when it came to be online for parenting education programs, which was really a breakthrough and very similar to the work we did, having a plan B, having an offline answer, which was often the previous technology, the CDs and the DVDs, or even a printed hard copy they could come and get. But having a plan B to the smooth online answer, I found, was a part of getting yeses, particularly from courts, because they actually have to serve everybody. 95% isn't really in their mind enough. So just from a perspective of proposals, thinking through, what would be an offline plan B for those who simply don't have access or the ability, to do it, I think is a part of best proposals.
Yeah, and that is actually one of our recommendations, is that we don't just go straight into ODR and not offer an alternative for people who cannot use it for whatever reason, which is unfortunately what one of the other programs that we evaluated did. They just took away mediation and left ODR, which then was not used. So it's kind of a step backwards. So yes, the courts are right about that. We should have a plan B for people who cannot access ODR.
Yeah, I always like to think of ODR as adding another option, adding a tool to the toolbox. If you give ODR and you take away another option, then as you say, it may net be a step backwards because you're reducing access. But I do think, in Colombia, where you've got 50% access, you build these tools, well, only 50% of people are going to utilize them. But as the internet encroaches more and more, people get more mobile devices, it gets to 60, 70, 80%, then they're going to get to where we are in the States. I mean, the amazing thing about India is they're digitizing all their services, and they have indigent populations, people that sleep on the street on cardboard boxes, but they have that mobile phone right next to their head. And it's not an iPhone X, it's like an old Nokia, but that's the lifeline, right? So if we can deliver services that way, I think we're going to access populations that couldn't access them face to face or you know,
Right.
via the phone.
Yeah, and in Michigan, we did find that 71% of the people who use the platform only use their phone to reach to
71%. That's amazing.
71%.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
and 92% use their phone at least once.
Wow.
I can remember the days looking at statistical reports when there was no mobile access, for example, from mediate.com. It was zero. Colin, I don't know if I just looked at the report yesterday.
Mhm.
We're over 70%
That's it.
that's at mediate.com.
That's
So
it.
it's like, you know, how much do you even design for a full computer? And it's really come full circle.
Mhm.
Well, I have this beautiful, powerful computer here with keyboard and big monitor and, you know, fancy headphones. And I'll go over and sit on my chair and be on my phone, even though it's 5 feet away. I'm going to do it because it's more convenient. It's more personalized.
You know, I'd love to know what the cost would be for giving people, I don't even, a burner phone or whatever kind of phone they would want
Yeah.
to temporarily be able to access the process. I'll bet it would net out very low cost for
No,
those.
homeless shelters in San Jose give away burner phones to every person who comes in every night.
Really?
Yeah, and they only have a certain number of minutes, but it's like, here, look, we want to be able to get in touch with you if we need you for any reason. So here's a phone. So
there might be a plan B or
Yeah, that's an interesting option.
B1, you know.
yeah. Well, I know we're at time here. Jen, I just want to say thank you, not only for this report. I think we need to deep dive more. And this is only one of your reports. You've done fantastic work in this ODR area. I think we need to do more sessions. I'd like to invite you back to present to iCoder. We can look at some of the other work that you've done. As we are sort of tackling this ODR 2.0, the only way that we up our game is to learn. And, you know, I love everybody in the ODR field, but we are not generating the quality of data that you have generated in this project. And one of the criticisms of the ODR field and the dispute resolution field writ large is we all just kind of write blurbs for each other's books and cite each other, you know, and it's like, oh, aren't we great? Yes. And Ethan's book is great. And then Ethan says, Colin's book is great. You know, it's like, okay, we're in an echo chamber, but occasionally we've got to have somebody that's committed to the truth and looking at the hard numbers. And sometimes that will, you know, people may not be excited about the lessons learned, you know, like 57% of people got outcomes that they said they weren't happy with. You know what? We better know that, because you can't fix something if you don't have a clear impression of it. And I want to thank you for this work, because I think it's really essential for all of us to learn from it. And I'm going to let you say something in a minute, but Nico, your hand's up. What did you want to say?
No, I also want to add on top of the data analytics, which I find extremely useful, and I think that should be applied to any analysis on ODR. I would also say that this is a very valuable work, because it's also taking into account people's emotions, which are far more relevant than like hard data. So really, thank you, Jen. I think this adds a lot of value to my own work, and I really appreciate it. So you can be the mother of ODR.
Godmother.
The godmother.
Only Ethan can pick the mother of ODR, but I can pick the godmother. So Jen's the godmother. Yeah.
Oh, thank you
Ethan,
so much for
you're
having me,
muted.
though. I really enjoyed this conversation, and all the work that you all have done in advance of me. And I really appreciate
we're all tied to each other as we climb this mountain. But Ethan, you're muted. Did you want to unmute and say something?
Nothing profound, just that I do recall Janet Rifkin 30 years ago said she was the grandmother of ODR.
Well, I got to give it to Janet. She was doing it before I was. So, you know, she's earned it. So you and Janet are the mother and father of ODR. You guys wrote the first book.
Could be worse.
Could be worse. So Jen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And I'm going to edit this down and I'll post a link and I'll send it to you. But thanks to everyone for joining too. Thanks for the great questions. And I look forward to seeing you at other Cyber Week sessions.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Okay.
As usual.